The last delivery. The clock struck 9:45 p.m., and Ethan Carter, a 22-year-old pizza courier, leaned against the counter of Franco's Pizzeria, scanning the last few orders on his delivery app. The small-town pizza joint wasn't bustling like it usually was, and the quiet felt almost unsettling. Most nights, the chaos of juggling orders left him too drained to think, but tonight the stillness gnawed at him. His shift was winding down, yet a lingering sense of incompleteness kept him rooted to the spot. Ethan clicked through the familiar list of regulars. Mr. Hanson always ordered his Hawaiian pizza extra crispy. The Jefferson family loved their meat lovers special. And Mrs. Parker, well, she could never resist an order of tiramisu. Yet one name was conspicuously absent: Mrs. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan was more than just a customer. She was a fixture in his routine, her order as predictable as the town's 10 p.m. train. A widow in her 70s, Mrs. Callahan called every other evening for her favorite margarita pizza and a side of garlic breadsticks. Over time, their brief exchanges at the door grew into warm conversations. She had the kind of voice that felt like a cozy blanket, soft and reassuring, with a touch of wistful nostalgia. Tonight, there was no order, no call, no familiar name lighting up his screen. It wasn't just unusual, it was downright odd. "Hey, Ethan," called Marco, his manager, snapping him out of his thoughts. "You good?" "Clock's ticking." "Man." Ethan hesitated before responding. "Yeah, just, Mrs. Callahan didn't place her order tonight. Feels weird." Marco shrugged, wiping his hands on a grease-stained towel. "Maybe she decided to cook for a change." "You worry too much, kid." But Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling. It wasn't like her to skip. She'd once told him that cooking wasn't the same since her arthritis had worsened. She'd joked about being Franco's unofficial mascot with how often she ordered. "Mind if I take her a pizza anyway?" Ethan asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just in case." Marco raised an eyebrow, but eventually nodded. "Sure. Take her usual." On the house. 5 minutes later, Ethan was driving down Birchwood Lane, the pizza warming the passenger seat beside him. The faint aroma of basil and mozzarella filled the car, but it did little to calm his nerves. The closer he got to Mrs. Callahan's street, the heavier the unease settled in his chest. When he turned onto her block, the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. Normally, porch lights glowed warmly along the row of modest houses. Tonight, most were dark, including Mrs. Callahan's. That was odd. She always left her porch light on. "It makes me feel safer," she once told him. Ethan parked his car and grabbed the pizza box, his eyes scanning her dimly lit home. The curtains were drawn, but something about their haphazard closure seemed off. The house itself appeared lifeless, the usual warm glow from her living room absent. He swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the growing knot in his stomach. He approached the door and knocked softly. "Mrs. Callahan." "It's Ethan from Franco's," he called out. His voice echoed in the stillness of the night. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Callahan, I brought your usual." Faint footsteps approached from inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and there she was, or at least a version of her. Ethan's heart sank at the sight. The lively, cheerful woman he remembered was replaced by a frail figure. Her face was pale and gaunt, her once bright eyes hollow. Her silver hair, usually styled neatly, was disheveled, and she wore a housecoat that hung loosely off her thin frame. A white bandage wrapped her right hand, and it trembled as she gripped the edge of the door. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Her tone wasn't warm, like it usually was. It was strained, almost fearful. Ethan forced a smile, trying to keep his worry from showing. "Just thought I'd bring your favorite. You didn't call tonight, so I figured maybe you forgot." Her eyes darted nervously over her shoulder before she looked back at him. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice faltering. "But I'm not hungry tonight." Something was wrong. Ethan could feel it in her hesitation, in the way she avoided meeting his eyes. "Are you okay, Mrs. Callahan? You don't look well. Is there someone I can call for you?" "Family. A friend." Her expression darkened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, no one. I'm fine, Ethan. You should go. It's late." Her attempt to close the door was slow and unsteady, and Ethan instinctively reached out to stop it. "Wait, are you sure?" "I can. I said I'm fine," she snapped, startling him. But just as quickly, her expression softened into one of regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just not a good time." Before he could respond, she closed the door, leaving him standing on the porch with the untouched pizza. Ethan stared at the door for a long moment, his mind racing. This wasn't just an off day for Mrs. Callahan. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. He made his way back to his car, but didn't leave. Instead, he sat there, his eyes fixed on the darkened house. The unease gnawed at him, louder than any voice of reason telling him to go home and forget about it. "Maybe I'm overreacting," he muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. But the memory of her trembling hand and the fear in her eyes refused to leave him. He glanced at the pizza box beside him, the scent of fresh dough and basil filling the car. It felt like a silent reminder of the woman who always tipped him with a smile and asked about his college classes. "No," he said firmly, his hand gripping the wheel. "I can't just leave her like this." Ethan reached for his phone and hesitated. Should he call the police? What would he even say? He wasn't sure if what he'd seen was enough to raise alarms, but his instincts told him he couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, he made up his mind. He wasn't going to leave until he knew Mrs. Callahan was safe. A whisper in the darkness. Ethan leaned back in his car seat, eyes glued to Mrs. Callahan's darkened house. The street was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the cool night breeze. The pizza box sat untouched beside him, its warmth fading with every passing minute. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, debating his next move. Every rational part of him screamed to drive away, to let it go. But his instincts, the same instincts that told him something wasn't right, kept him rooted in place. He decided to step out of the car. The air outside was cooler than he'd expected, biting against his skin. He tucked his jacket tighter around him and walked back toward the house, his footsteps muffled by the cracked pavement of her walkway. Ethan paused at the edge of the porch, staring at the faint glow of a single light coming from a room upstairs. He'd never known Mrs. Callahan to leave lights on in unoccupied rooms. She always complained about high electricity bills. He knocked again, softer this time, not wanting to alarm her. "Mrs. Callahan." "It's me, Ethan. Are you sure you're okay?" Silence. Then, faintly, he heard something. A shuffle, followed by what sounded like a low groan. His heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Callahan." He called again, louder now. "Please, if you need help, just let me know." This time, the sound came again, clearer. A muffled noise, like someone trying to speak but unable to form words. It was coming from inside the house. Ethan's stomach tightened. He stepped closer to the door and leaned his ear against it. "Mrs. Callahan," he said softly, his voice trembling. The faint sound of a creaking floorboard sent a shiver down his spine. Someone was inside. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just having a bad day and wanted to be left alone. But the memory of her hollow eyes and trembling hand flashed in his mind, and he knew he couldn't walk away. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He typed a quick message to his friend Luke, a rookie cop at the local precinct. "Something's not right at Mrs. Callahan's place. Can you swing by?" Luke's reply came almost immediately. "Can't leave my shift yet. Call it in if it's serious." Ethan stared at the message, biting his lip. He didn't have enough to go on to make an official report, but his gut told him he needed to act. He tried the doorbell, pressing it twice. No answer. Then he noticed something odd. The door wasn't fully closed. It was barely ajar, the latch resting against the frame. A subtle push, and it would swing open. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm coming in, okay? I just want to make sure you're all right." He nudged the door open, the old hinges groaning loudly in the still night. The living room came into view, dimly lit by the glow of a single table lamp. The space, once meticulously tidy, was now a chaotic mess. Books lay scattered across the floor. A chair was overturned, and the coffee table had a suspicious dent in its surface. "Mrs. Callahan," he called again, stepping cautiously inside. The air was thick, heavy with an acrid smell he couldn't quite place. It was faint but unsettling, a mix of mildew and something metallic. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, his heart racing as he took in the disarray. This wasn't just a bad day. Something had happened here. A muffled sound drew his attention to the hallway leading toward the kitchen. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to pull him forward. He moved slowly, his footsteps barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. "Mrs. Callahan." He tried again, his voice a whisper now. As he approached the kitchen, the smell grew stronger, and so did the feeling of unease. He rounded the corner and froze. The kitchen looked as though it hadn't been used in days. Plates sat piled in the sink, their surfaces crusted with dried food. A pot on the stove had a layer of mold growing inside. The fridge door was slightly ajar, revealing an almost empty interior. But it was the back door that caught his attention. It was wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. Outside, the backyard was shrouded in darkness, the tall hedges casting long shadows. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Mrs. Callahan," he called out, louder this time, hoping against hope she would answer. Then, from upstairs, he heard it again, the muffled groan, louder now, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. His breath hitched. Someone was definitely up there. He turned toward the staircase, his legs feeling like lead as he forced himself to move. The stairs creaked under his weight, each step echoing like a warning. The house felt colder the higher he climbed, the air tinged with that same metallic scent. When he reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by the flickering light from the room at the far end. The sound of dragging stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. Ethan hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, the floorboards groaning beneath him. As he approached the door, he noticed it was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. He reached out, pushing the door open slowly. The sight inside made his blood run cold. Mrs. Callahan was slumped in a chair by the window, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her head lolled to the side, and her eyes fluttered open weakly as she saw him. "Ethan," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Before he could react, a shadow moved behind her. A man, tall, thin, and wearing a stained hoodie, stepped out of the darkness. His face was obscured by the flickering light, but the glint of a knife in his hand was unmistakable. "Who the hell are you?" the man growled, his voice rough and menacing. Ethan froze, his mind racing. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't leave Mrs. Callahan like this. "I'm just a delivery guy," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble." The man's eyes darted between Ethan and Mrs. Callahan, his grip tightening on the knife. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. "Look, I'll leave. Just don't hurt her, okay?" The man's lips curled into a sneer. Too late for that. As the man took a step toward him, Ethan's mind raced. He needed to think fast. He glanced around the room, searching for anything he could use to defend himself, or better yet, to distract the man long enough to get Mrs. Callahan out of there. His eyes landed on a heavy vase sitting on a nearby shelf. It wasn't much, but it was something. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ethan inched closer to the shelf, keeping his eyes locked on the intruder. "I don't want any trouble," Ethan repeated, his voice steadying. "But if you don't back off." The man laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Or what?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the vase and hurled it at the man with all his strength. The vase shattered against the man's shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a curse. Ethan didn't wait. He darted forward, grabbing Mrs. Callahan's chair and dragging it toward the door. The man recovered quickly, lunging after them with the knife. Ethan barely managed to dodge, his heart pounding as he shoved the chair into the hallway. "Run!" he yelled, even though Mrs. Callahan was too weak to move on her own. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Shadows of the past. Ethan's adrenaline surged as he dragged Mrs. Callahan's chair down the narrow hallway. The dim light from the single flickering bulb barely illuminated the path, but he didn't have time to hesitate. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet felt like a countdown. Behind him, the intruder's heavy footsteps thundered, growing louder with every second. "Ethan," Mrs. Callahan whispered weakly, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Leave me. Go." "Not a chance," Ethan shot back, his voice firm despite his own terror. "We're getting out of here together." The stairs loomed ahead, their descent into darkness looking more treacherous than ever. Ethan knew he couldn't carry Mrs. Callahan down the steps in her chair. It was too heavy, too unwieldy. He'd have to think fast. He glanced over his shoulder just as the intruder appeared at the end of the hallway, his knife glinting in the faint light. "You're not going anywhere," the man roared, his voice echoing through the old house. Ethan gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the chair's handles. Without another word, he yanked Mrs. Callahan out of the chair and hoisted her into his arms. Her frail body felt impossibly light, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. The intruder lunged, but Ethan was already moving, sprinting down the stairs two at a time. Behind him, the man cursed loudly, the sound of his heavy boots pounding against the steps in pursuit. Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs and stumbled into the cluttered living room. His eyes darted to the front door, but it was too far away. The man was gaining on them, and Ethan knew they wouldn't make it in time. He had to find another way out. He turned toward the kitchen, his feet sliding on the slick hardwood floor as he adjusted his grip on Mrs. Callahan. She clung weakly to his jacket, her head resting against his shoulder. "Please, don't," she murmured, her words barely audible. "I've got you," Ethan said, though his own voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Just hold on." The kitchen was as chaotic as he'd left it. Dishes piled high in the sink, the back door hanging open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a chill down his spine. It was their only chance. He burst through the back door and into the overgrown yard, the tall hedges casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The ground was uneven, and Ethan nearly tripped as he navigated the narrow path. The man's voice carried through the night, a string of angry shouts growing louder with each step. Ethan's mind raced. The yard was fenced in, but he knew there was a gate at the far end. If he could just reach it, they might have a chance to escape. He pushed forward, his legs burning with effort. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind him. Ethan glanced over his shoulder to see the intruder smashing through the back door, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can run from me?" the man bellowed, brandishing the knife as he stormed into the yard. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The gate was still several yards away, and he knew he couldn't outrun the man while carrying Mrs. Callahan. He had to slow him down. His eyes scanned the yard for anything he could use. His gaze landed on a rusted rake leaning against the side of the house. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He gently set Mrs. Callahan down behind a thick hedge and grabbed the rake, gripping it tightly in his hands. The man advanced, his eyes locked on Ethan. "You should have stayed out of this, kid," he snarled. "Now you're both gonna regret it." Ethan didn't respond. He stepped into the open, positioning himself between the man and Mrs. Callahan. His hands trembled as he raised the rake, its rusty prongs gleaming in the moonlight. The man laughed, a harsh guttural sound. "What are you gonna do with that?" "Poke me to death." Ethan didn't wait for him to attack. He swung the rake with all his might, aiming for the man's arm. The prongs grazed his sleeve, but it was enough to make him stagger back. The man cursed, his grip on the knife faltering for a moment. "Stay back," Ethan shouted, his voice shaking but determined. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The man's sneer faltered, but only for a moment. He lunged again, this time swiping at Ethan with the knife. Ethan barely managed to dodge, the blade slicing through the air inches from his face. He swung the rake again, this time catching the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. Ethan didn't hesitate. He kicked the knife away and swung the rake one final time, striking the man in the chest. The force sent him stumbling back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground with a heavy thud. Ethan dropped the rake and rushed back to Mrs. Callahan, who was still huddled behind the hedge. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice urgent. She nodded weakly, and he helped her to her feet. Together, they made their way to the gate at the edge of the yard. Ethan fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking, but he finally managed to get it open. They slipped through and onto the darkened street beyond. The man's shouts echoed behind them, but Ethan didn't look back. He kept moving, his arm around Mrs. Callahan to steady her. The quiet street felt like a lifeline, the dim glow of the streetlights guiding them forward. As they reached the end of the block, Ethan spotted the faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. A car was approaching, its engine humming softly. He stepped into the street, waving his arms to flag it down. The car slowed and came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, rolled down the window. "What's going on? Are you two okay?" Ethan nodded, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Please, call the police. There's a man in that house. He's dangerous." The driver's eyes widened, and he quickly pulled out his phone. "Hang on. I'll call right now." Ethan turned to Mrs. Callahan, who was leaning heavily against him. Her eyes were filled with tears, her frail body trembling. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if the man wasn't alone? What if this wasn't over? Hidden truths. The distant wail of approaching sirens cut through the stillness of the night as Ethan held Mrs. Callahan close, his mind racing. The man in the house, the intruder, was dangerous, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a random break-in. Mrs. Callahan had looked too frail, too fearful, and the disarray inside her home told a story that went beyond a simple burglary. The driver who had stopped to help stayed nearby, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke hurriedly to the emergency dispatcher. Ethan glanced back toward Mrs. Callahan's house, half expecting the man to burst out the front door at any moment. But the house remained eerily silent, its darkened windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. "Ethan." Mrs. Callahan's weak voice pulled him back. She gripped his arm tightly, her trembling fingers digging into his jacket. "We have to go. Now." "It's okay," Ethan reassured her, though his own voice was shaky. "Help is on the way. The police will handle this." Her head shook violently, her eyes wide with panic. "No, you don't understand. He's not alone." Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean? Who's not alone?" Her lips quivered as tears welled up in her eyes. "They'll come back. They always do." Before Ethan could press her further, the first police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing blue and red against the quiet neighborhood. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face, approached Ethan and Mrs. Callahan cautiously. "Are you the one who called this in?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning the scene. Ethan nodded. "I'm Ethan Carter. I deliver pizza, and, well, something wasn't right at her house. There's a guy inside. He had a knife. He attacked us." The officer's expression darkened, and he signaled to his partner, "Stay with them. I'm going to check it out." As the first officer moved toward the house, his partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes, turned her attention to Mrs. Callahan. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head, but her grip on Ethan didn't loosen. "I just want to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, take me away from here." The officer crouched slightly, her tone softening. "We'll make sure you're safe, ma'am, but we need to know what's going on. Can you tell me who that man is?" Mrs. Callahan's gaze darted to Ethan, then back to the officer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Finally, she whispered, "He's someone from my past." The cryptic response sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "From your past? Mrs. Callahan, what does that mean?" Before she could answer, the sound of a scuffle erupted from the house. A loud crash echoed into the night, followed by a string of curses. The first officer's voice boomed over his radio. "Suspect fleeing. He's heading toward the east alley. Request backup." Ethan's heart leaped into his throat as he watched the shadowy figure of the intruder dart out of the backyard, disappearing into the darkness. The officer gave chase, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The second officer cursed under her breath, grabbing her radio. "Unit 3, suspect is on foot. Last seen heading eastbound. All units converge." Ethan turned back to Mrs. Callahan, who looked more terrified than ever. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "They'll catch him." But Mrs. Callahan shook her head again, her frail body trembling. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not just him. They're everywhere." The officers escorted Mrs. Callahan and Ethan to the station for questioning, the flashing lights of the police cars casting long shadows on the quiet streets as they drove away from her home. Ethan stayed close to Mrs. Callahan, his protective instincts kicking in as she clung to his arm like a lifeline. At the station, a detective named Sarah Morrison, a no-nonsense woman with piercing green eyes and a calm demeanor, led them into an interview room. She offered Mrs. Callahan a blanket and a cup of tea before sitting down across from them, her notebook and pen at the ready. "Mrs. Callahan," Detective Morrison began gently, "can you tell us what happened tonight? Who was that man in your house?" Mrs. Callahan hesitated, her eyes darting to Ethan, as if silently asking for his support. He gave her a reassuring nod, and she took a shaky breath. "His name is Gerald," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He worked for my late husband many years ago." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Worked for your husband? What do you mean?" She hesitated again, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. "My husband owned a construction company," she explained. "Gerald was one of his employees, but he had problems. Anger issues, a criminal record. My husband gave him a chance when no one else would." "And why would he come after you now?" Detective Morrison asked, her tone calm but probing. "What does he want?" Mrs. Callahan's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she admitted, "but he's been watching me for weeks. I've seen him outside my house at night. Sometimes he leaves notes on my porch, saying I owe him." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Ethan felt a surge of anger. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked, trying to keep his frustration in check. She looked up at him, her face etched with guilt. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said softly. "I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away." Detective Morrison scribbled notes before leaning forward. "Mrs. Callahan, this is important. You mentioned earlier that they might come back. Who are you referring to? Are there others involved?" Mrs. Callahan hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she feared someone might overhear. "Gerald wasn't the only one my husband helped," she said finally. "There were others, men who worked for him, men with troubled pasts. After my husband passed, I started getting letters, phone calls. They said I owed them because my husband promised to help them start over. Detective Morrison exchanged a glance with Ethan, her expression grim. "And you think Gerald and these others might be working together?" Mrs. Callahan nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket tighter. "They think I have money, but I don't. I've been living off my savings, and now I'm afraid they'll do anything to get what they want." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. Mrs. Callahan had been living in fear, and he hadn't seen the signs. He thought back to her warm smiles, her kind words. How had she managed to hide so much pain? Detective Morrison broke the silence. "We're going to do everything we can to protect you, Mrs. Callahan, but we'll need your help to piece this together." Mrs. Callahan nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. Ethan reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "We'll get through it." But as the words left his mouth, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much deeper, darker truth. The web of shadows. The next morning, sunlight poured into the quiet police station, casting long beams across the linoleum floor. Ethan sat in a chair by the window, his legs bouncing with restless energy. Sleep had been elusive the night before, his thoughts tangled in the revelations about Mrs. Callahan's past and the danger she faced. Across from him, Mrs. Callahan sat bundled in a thick blanket, staring absently into her teacup. Her frail form seemed even smaller under the weight of her fear. Detective Sarah Morrison entered the room, her face grim. She placed a folder on the table and sat down, her green eyes locking onto Mrs. Callahan's. "We've done some digging," she said, her voice steady but heavy. "And we need to talk." Ethan leaned forward, his attention snapping to the detective. "Did they find Gerald?" Morrison shook her head. "Not yet. He slipped through the net last night, but that's not all we've uncovered." She opened the folder and slid a series of photographs across the table. Grainy surveillance images showed Gerald and two other men standing outside what looked like an old warehouse. The timestamp was from 2 nights ago. "These men," Morrison began, pointing to the unfamiliar faces in the photos, "have been linked to a string of home invasions and robberies across 3 neighboring towns. In each case, the victims were older individuals, people living alone." Mrs. Callahan's hands trembled as she looked at the images. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew he wasn't alone." Morrison nodded. "We believe Gerald and his associates are targeting you for the same reason they targeted those other victims. They think you're vulnerable. And based on what you told us about your late husband's promises, they might also think you have access to money or valuables." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So, what happens now? How do we keep her safe?" The detective leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We've stationed officers near her home to monitor any suspicious activity. In the meantime, we're working to track down Gerald and his associates." But she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Mrs. Callahan. "We need to know everything you can tell us, no matter how small it seems." Mrs. Callahan took a shaky breath and placed her teacup on the table. "There's something I haven't told you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Something I didn't think mattered until now." Ethan and Morrison exchanged a glance. "Go on," the detective urged gently. Mrs. Callahan's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "My husband kept a safe in the house," she said quietly. "It's hidden in the basement, behind the old bookcase. I never thought much about it. He always said it was just for important papers, but after he passed, I found a key in his desk drawer. When I opened the safe, there was money. A lot of it." Ethan's eyes widened. "How much are we talking about?" She shook her head. "I don't know exactly. I didn't count it. But it's enough that if Gerald knew about it, he might think it was worth hurting me for." Morrison's expression hardened. "Why didn't you report this before?" Mrs. Callahan's voice broke. "I was scared. I didn't know who to trust. And after the first letter arrived, I thought, if I ignored them, they'd go away." Ethan leaned closer, his voice firm but kind. Mrs. Callahan, this isn't your fault, but we need to figure out how they found out about the safe. Morrison nodded, flipping through the file. Your husband's construction business, she mused. If Gerald worked for him, he might have known about the safe or overheard something. And if these men are working together, they could have pieced it together over time. Mrs. Callahan nodded weakly. He was always around, even after he stopped working for my husband. Sometimes he'd show up at the house, asking for favors, borrowing money. I should have seen it coming. Ethan reached out, his hand resting on hers. We'll figure this out. But first, we need to make sure you're somewhere safe. Morrison stood, gathering the photos. We'll arrange for Mrs. Callahan to stay in a secure location while we investigate. But Ethan, I have to ask, how did you know something was wrong last night? What made you go back? Ethan hesitated, his mind flashing back to the moment he'd seen her darkened house. It was instinct, he admitted. She didn't place her usual order, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I saw how scared she looked, I just knew. The detective nodded, a faint smile breaking her stern expression. Good instincts. They might have saved her life. That evening, Mrs. Callahan was relocated to a safe house under police protection. Ethan visited her before she left, bringing her a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite flowers, he remembered from one of their many conversations. She smiled weakly as she accepted them, her eyes glistening with tears. You're a good boy, Ethan, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd have done without you. He squeezed her hand. You'll be okay. They'll keep you safe. As Mrs. Callahan was escorted away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. The safe, the money, the letters, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. And Gerald was still out there, along with his accomplices. Determined to help in any way he could, Ethan approached Detective Morrison before leaving the station. What can I do? He asked. There has to be something. Morrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. There is, she said. We're going to need someone who knows Mrs. Callahan well, someone she trusts, to help us reconstruct what might have tipped Gerald off about the safe. If you're up for it, we could use your help. Ethan didn't hesitate. I'm in. The next morning, Ethan and Morrison returned to Mrs. Callahan's house, now an active crime scene. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, and officers moved methodically through the rooms, cataloging evidence. The once cozy home felt eerie and lifeless, its walls holding the weight of the past. In the basement, they found the safe exactly where Mrs. Callahan had described it. It was large and imposing, its steel door marked with faint scratches, evidence that someone had tried to tamper with it. Morrison knelt to examine the safe, her gloved hands tracing the edges. It doesn't look like they managed to break in, she observed. But they knew it was here. Ethan scanned the room, his eyes falling on a dusty shelf filled with old photo albums and knickknacks. One album, in particular, caught his attention. Its spine was labeled Callahan Construction. Team photos. He pulled it from the shelf and flipped it open, revealing a series of black and white snapshots. Groups of men in hard hats and tool belts smiled back at him, their faces frozen in time. He recognized a younger version of Mrs. Callahan's husband in several of the photos, standing proudly with his crew. And then he saw it, a face he recognized instantly. Gerald. There, Ethan said, holding up the photo. That's him, isn't it? Morrison leaned closer, her expression sharpening. That's him. But as Ethan turned the page, his stomach dropped. Gerald wasn't the only familiar face. Two other men stood beside him in multiple photos, faces that matched the ones in the surveillance images Morrison had shown them. They were all here, Ethan realized, his voice low. They've been planning this for a long time. Morrison's jaw tightened, and now we know who to look for. Ethan set the album down, his determination hardening into resolve. Let's find them before it's too late. Closing the circle. The tension in the air was palpable as Detective Morrison and her team worked to piece together the final threads of the case. Ethan stood in the middle of Mrs. Callahan's dimly lit living room, staring at the photo album they'd uncovered in the basement. The faces of Gerald and his two accomplices stared back at him from decades-old snapshots, frozen in time but eerily alive in his mind. They knew her husband, Ethan murmured, flipping through the pages again. They knew about the safe, the money, all of it. Detective Morrison nodded as she studied a map of the area spread out on the coffee table. We've identified Gerald's accomplices, Tom Novick and Keith Ramirez. Both have long rap sheets, burglary, assault, you name it. And based on Mrs. Callahan's description, they think she's sitting on a fortune. Ethan's stomach churned. What's our next move? They're still out there. Morrison glanced at him, her expression grim. We've tracked a potential hideout. An abandoned warehouse just outside town. It's the same place Gerald and the others were spotted in the surveillance photos. We're organizing a raid, but I need you to stay here. Ethan bristled. Stay here. After everything that's happened, you think I'm just going to sit on the sidelines? Morrison placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You've done more than enough already, Ethan. You got Mrs. Callahan out of harm's way. Now let us do our job. Before Ethan could protest, Morrison's radio crackled to life. Unit 4 to Detective Morrison. We've got movement near the warehouse. Requesting backup. Morrison grabbed her jacket, her expression hardening. That's our cue. As the officers filed out of the house, Ethan lingered by the window, watching the patrol cars disappear down the street. His chest tightened with frustration and fear. He felt like he'd been dropped into the middle of a story he couldn't walk away from, but now he was being asked to stand aside. And then something caught his eye. A shadow moved across the side of the house. It was quick, barely visible, but unmistakable. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he stepped closer to the window, peering into the darkness. There it was again, a flicker of movement near the hedge at the edge of the yard. His pulse quickened. They're here. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed Morrison's number, his hands trembling. The call went straight to voicemail. He cursed under his breath and looked around the room for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a heavy lamp sitting on the side table. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He moved toward the front door, his steps careful and deliberate. The house felt eerily silent, the creaks of the old floorboards the only sound accompanying him. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Suddenly, the sound of glass shattering rang out from the back of the house. Ethan spun around, his heart pounding. He rushed toward the noise, gripping the lamp tightly. In the kitchen, the back door hung open. The glass panel shattered. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint smell of cigarette smoke. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, his ears straining to pick up any sound. And then he heard it, a low voice, muttering from somewhere nearby. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing. Ethan's grip tightened on the lamp. Think, Ethan. Think. He moved toward the hallway, his footsteps as quiet as he could manage. As he turned the corner, he caught sight of a figure hunched over, rifling through a drawer in Mrs. Callahan's desk. The man's back was to him, but Ethan recognized him immediately. It was Gerald. Ethan's first instinct was to charge, to catch him off guard. But before he could act, another voice called out from behind him. Find anything. Ethan ducked into the shadows as a second man entered the room. It was one of the men from the photo, Tom. He carried a crowbar in one hand, tapping it lightly against his palm. Nothing yet, Gerald growled, slamming the drawer shut. But it's here. I know it is. Tom sneered. Better hurry up. Cops'll be crawling this place soon enough. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't take on both men alone, not with a lamp as his only weapon. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes flicked to the door leading to the basement. An idea sparked in his mind, risky but potentially effective. He crept toward the door, careful to stay out of sight, and slipped inside, descending the stairs as quietly as possible. In the basement, he found what he was looking for: an old toolbox. He opened it, his hands fumbling as he searched for anything he could use. His fingers closed around a wrench, its weight reassuring in his hand. Above him, the voices grew louder. They were moving through the house, searching room by room. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't going to let them get away. Not this time. When the footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs, Ethan positioned himself behind the door, wrench in hand. The door creaked open, and Gerald's voice rang out. "Check down here," he barked. "I'll take the upstairs." Ethan's heart pounded as Tom descended the stairs, his crowbar gleaming in the dim light. He waited until the man was fully inside before stepping out of the shadows. "Looking for something?" Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Tom spun around, startled, but Ethan didn't give him a chance to react. He swung the wrench, aiming for Tom's hand. The impact sent the crowbar clattering to the floor. Tom cursed and lunged at him, but Ethan was faster, dodging the attack and delivering another blow to the man's side. Tom crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Ethan grabbed the crowbar and rushed back up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. He knew Gerald would have heard the commotion, and sure enough, the man appeared at the end of the hallway, his knife glinting in the faint light. "You've got guts, kid," Gerald sneered, advancing slowly, "but you're out of your league." Ethan didn't respond. He tightened his grip on the crowbar, his stance steady. When Gerald lunged, Ethan swung with all his strength. The metal connected with Gerald's arm, sending the knife flying. Gerald stumbled back, clutching his arm, but his expression was one of pure rage. Before either of them could move again, the sound of sirens filled the air, followed by the heavy footsteps of officers storming the house. "Police, drop your weapon." Morrison's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Gerald froze, his eyes darting to the front door as officers flooded the hallway. He raised his hand slowly, his face twisting into a sneer. "You got lucky, kid," he hissed. Ethan stepped back, letting the officers take over. As they cuffed Gerald and escorted him outside, Morrison approached Ethan, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You okay?" she asked, glancing at the crowbar still in his hand. Ethan nodded, his chest heaving. "Yeah, but I think I've had enough excitement for one night." Morrison smiled faintly. "You did good, Ethan. Better than good." As the officers cleared the house and loaded Gerald and Tom into the back of a cruiser, Ethan stepped outside, the cool night air washing over him. For the first time in what felt like hours, he allowed himself to breathe. The ordeal was over. Mrs. Callahan was safe, and the men who had terrorized her were in custody. But as Ethan looked up at the night sky, he couldn't help but wonder how many others out there needed someone to notice, to step in, to care. And for the first time, he realized that maybe he was that someone.